Picture this: an emperor, 64 years old, riding into a wasteland of grass and wind and silence. No palace, no throne, no safety. Just him, his armies, and a threat he refused to let live. This wasn't desperation. This was obsession. The year was 1424, and the Yongle Emperor, the man who built Beijing, who sent fleets across the oceans, who clawed a throne from his own nephew, was about to ride to his death. Not in battle, not in defeat, but still chasing an enemy he could never quite catch. To understand why, we have to go back to a time when the greatest empire in Asia had one problem it could not solve: the people beyond the wall. Before Yongle was an emperor, he was a soldier. As Prince of Yuan, he was stationed at Beijing, the cold, exposed edge of China. While other princes lived comfortable lives in the warm south, Judy was on the frontier, learning to fight, learning to survive. His neighbors weren't merchants, they weren't scholars, they were Mongols. He watched them, he studied them, he led patrols against them, and he learned something that would never leave him. The Mongols weren't dangerous because they were numerous, they were dangerous because they were fast. Their cavalry could cross hundreds of kilometers before a Ming army even laced up its boots. They carried minimal supplies. They could raid a village, burn it to the ground, and vanish before anyone could respond. Walls could slow them down, but walls couldn't stop a united steppe. And that was the lesson that haunted Judy for the rest of his life. When Mongols fought each other, China was safe. When they united, empires fell. After all, the Yuan dynasty, the one that ruled all of China, had been born from exactly that: scattered tribes that found a single man to follow: Genghis Khan. When Judy finally seized the throne and became the Yongle Emperor, he didn't change. He brought a frontier commander's mindset into the Forbidden City. He didn't believe in waiting for danger. He believed in riding out to kill it first. More than 40 years had passed since the Mongols were driven from China. The great Yuan dynasty had collapsed. The Ming was flourishing. The Forbidden City was rising stone by stone. Trade flowed across Asia. To most officials in the Ming court, the Mongols were a problem to be managed. To Yongle, they were an unfinished war. Because beyond the Great Wall, the old blood still mattered. Among the eastern tribes, one man had seized control of the situation with cold precision. His name was Arughtai. He wasn't a Khan. He had no Chinggisid blood. On the steppe, that normally meant a ceiling on your ambitions. Arughtai found a way around it. In 1408, he killed the existing eastern Mongol leader, a man named Arughtemur, who had no royal blood either and had made enemies on all sides. Then, Arughtai reached into the old bloodlines and pulled out a man named Bunyashiri, a direct descendant of Genghis Khan himself, and placed him on the throne, a puppet Khan. With Arughtai pulling every string, it was a brilliant move. Bunyashiri gave Arughtai the one thing he couldn't manufacture himself: legitimacy. That ancient bloodline was a magnet for Mongol warriors who still dreamed of the old empire. Tribes that would never follow a commoner would rally to a son of Genghis. And in the west, another power was stirring. The Oirats, the Western Mongol Confederation, were growing under their own ambitious leader, a man named Mahmud. The steppe was dividing into two competing power blocks. Yongle watched all of it from Beijing, his spies reported. His border commanders warned. And the emperor recognized the pattern. Small tribes become confederations. Confederations become empires. Empires invade China. He had no intention of waiting for the last step. The crisis broke in 1409. Bunyashiri, backed by Arughai's military muscle, executed a Ming ambassador who had been sent to demand their submission. On the steppe, that meant one thing: a declaration of war. The Ming court debated diplomacy, stronger walls. Wait and see. Yongle rejected everything. There was only one answer: strike now, while the enemy is still divided. Strike fast before this puppet Khan and his puppet master have time to unite the entire steppe behind them. And then he said the thing that shocked his entire court. He would lead the army himself. The Son of Heaven, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, On horseback in the Mongolian grasslands. Many officials were horrified. Yongle didn't care. He had won his throne on a battlefield. He trusted soldiers. He trusted his own eyes. In 1410, the imperial army marched north. The scale was staggering. Thousands of soldiers, thousands of horses, supply columns stretching back to the horizon. But the deeper they pushed into the steppe, the harder it got. Water was scarce. Weather was unpredictable. And Bunyashiri, sheltered behind Arughthai's cavalry, refused to stand still, until finally Yongle forced a confrontation. On June 15, 1410, at the Onon River, the same river where Genghis Khan himself had once been proclaimed ruler of all Mongols, Ming forces annihilated Bunyashiri's army. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, but Bunyashiri escaped. He fled west, straight into the territory of the Oirats, of Mahmud. And Mahmud had no interest in sheltering a broken, humiliated Khan who had just been crushed by the Ming. Old rivalries resurfaced, old grudges were settled. Bunyashiri, the last Chinggis Khan of the eastern steppe, was killed by the very people he had fled to for safety. The puppet had outlived his usefulness to everyone. The emperor had won, or so he thought. Because through all of this, the battle, the rout, the flight, the death, one man had survived completely untouched. Arughtai had watched everything. He watched Bunyashiri charge into the Ming army and get destroyed. He watched the Oirats finish what the Ming had started, and he had learned he would not make the same mistakes. While Yongle returned to Beijing, believing the threat had been broken, Arughtai quietly began rebuilding. Tribe by tribe, alliance by alliance. But now there was a new problem on the horizon. The Oirats, Mahmud's confederation, had grown dangerously powerful. The defeat of Bunyashiri had removed their main rival. Now they were the dominant force on the steppe. By 1413, Mahmud had mobilized 30,000 troops toward the Ming frontier. Yongle rode north again. His officials were stunned. The empire was booming. Beijing was transforming into the grandest city in the world. The Grand Canal was being rebuilt. Zheng He's treasure fleets were crossing oceans most Chinese emperors had never even imagined. Surely the emperor had enough to do. Yongle's answer was simple. None of that matters if the north isn't secure. In 1414, the Ming army met Mahmud's forces near the upper Tula River. Ming cannons shattered the Oirat lines. Mahmud and his puppet Khan, Delbeg, fled the battlefield. The Oirats were broken. Yongle returned to Beijing victorious, but what happened next, nobody in the Ming court had predicted. In 1416, Arughtai rode west and killed Mahmud and killed Delbeg. In one move, he had eliminated the only power on the steppe that could rival him. The Ming had weakened the Oirats. Arughtai had finished them. He had let two empires do his work for him. Now Bunyashiri was dead. Mahmud was dead. The Oirats were shattered. And Arughtai, the man with no royal blood, no ancient title, no claim to the legacy of Genghis Khan, was the last man standing on the entire Mongolian steppe. The emperor had solved two problems. He had created a third, and this one would prove impossible to kill. Arughtai was unlike any enemy Yongle had faced before. He didn't want glory. He didn't want a decisive battle. He wanted survival. And he was brilliant at it. When the Ming army advanced, Arughtai withdrew. When the Ming retreated, Arughtai returned. His cavalry moved across distances that Ming supply lines simply couldn't match. Because that was the other problem. Moving a Ming army across the steppe wasn't like moving a cavalry raid. It was like moving a city. Thousands of soldiers needed food every day. Thousands of horses needed water, weapons, medicine, fodder. Every kilometer north meant the supply lines stretched thinner. And Arughtai knew this. Scouts would report Mongol forces nearby. The army would prepare for battle. Dawn would come, and the camps would be empty. Arughtai had vanished again. For 3 campaigns, the pattern repeated. The army marches, the enemy retreats, the steppe stays silent, the army comes home, no decisive victory, no surrender, no end, just an old emperor on horseback, staring at an empty horizon. In 1424, Yongle prepared for one last campaign. He was 64 years old, his generals were worried, his ministers were worried. Everyone around him could see what the years of war had cost him. He rode anyway, because Arughtai was still out there, because the frontier was still uncertain, because Yongle had never in his life been able to accept a problem he hadn't personally tried to solve. The army marched north one final time, and the familiar silence answered them. Arughtai withdrew. The Ming forces pursued. The grasslands stretched on without end. There would be no great final battle, no triumphant capture, no moment of closure. Just the wind and the grass, and an emperor who had chased this enemy for over a decade and still couldn't bring him to ground. On the return journey, Yongle fell ill. The campaigns, the civil war, the decades of relentless, driven, furious labor, it had all accumulated to this moment. On August 12, 1424, the Yongle Emperor died on the road back from his final campaign. His commanders kept the news secret. They feared panic. They held the army together, completed the march, and only when the troops were safely home did the word finally go out. The emperor was gone. The man who built the Forbidden City, who sent Zheng He across the world's oceans, who seized a throne no one expected him to take, spent the final chapter of his life chasing a warlord across an empty grassland. He never caught him, but he never stopped riding. And in the end, the emperor who had spent a lifetime marching toward the frontier took his final journey there. His horse never came back to Beijing, but the lesson he carried his entire life, that one came back just fine. Never wait for the enemy to come to you. Ride out and meet him first.